Time to pull up a chair. We've got another great story for you today in the rLounge. Retirement. The time of life when you finally hang up your work boots, toss your alarm clock into the nearest recycling bin, and start living out those long-neglected dreams of travel. Today in the rLounge, OP's adventures clash hands-on with her son's vision of a full-time, unpaid nanny. Entitled son withheld my grandson because I refused to be a nanny. I cut him off and canceled his trust fund. I, 60 female, just retired a few months ago after working for almost 5 decades. I'm an immigrant who came to this country with only the clothes on my back, and I worked like a horse to build a better life for myself and my 2 children, John, 30 male, and Sandra, 30 female. Unfortunately, their father passed shortly after they were born, which made things very difficult for us. I was a young woman with 2 children in a new country. I did whatever I could to make sure my kids were well provided for. For most of their childhoods, I worked 2 or sometimes 3 jobs at a time to make ends meet and provide for them. Things got easier for me when I met my husband, Pat, 72 male. He's the sweetest man I've ever met, but with 2 teenage kids, I wasn't sure I was ready for a relationship at the time. Once he met the children, though, I saw how much they liked each other, and that made up my mind. We dated for a year and a half before we decided to get married. Since then, things got a lot better for me and my kids. Pat had never wanted children of his own, but he stepped up and took care of both of my kids like they were his own blood. He really is the light of my life, and I don't know what I would do without him. Now, Pat wasn't a rich man, but he had a very good job, and he's smart with money. He immediately started living a trust for both of the children, and we both put money into it every month. As the years went by, we both started earning more, and we were able to add more to the trust too. Pat had the money in the trust invested so that it was generating a good amount of interest yearly. The idea was that they wouldn't touch the principal. They would only be able to access the interest yearly once they turned 28. It worked out fine because it turned out to be a good chunk of money. Not enough for them to live on, but just enough to let them live a little bit more comfortably. I was extremely proud of being able to provide that for my children. Recently, my son and his wife, Ashley, 31 female, had their first child, a beautiful baby boy. I was thrilled to become a grandmother. I love my grandson very much, and when they first brought him home, I couldn't keep my hands off the little angel. I spent as much time as I could helping them take care of him so they could have a smoother adjustment into life as parents. My son and daughter-in-law appreciated the help, but soon they started making comments that concerned me. They would suggest that I could babysit for them during the week while they worked since I had so much free time now that I was retired. I would laugh when they said that, but I always reminded them that as much as I love spending time with my grandson, I had plans for my time as well. It's always been my dream to travel the world, ever since I was a little girl. I've wanted to experience different cultures and see what the world has to offer. Being freshly retired, I started making plans to make my dream a reality. Pat was getting a bit older, and he'd never had much interest in traveling, so I would be doing most of the traveling alone. I didn't mind that. In fact, I was looking forward to it, and even had a Pinterest board with the countries I planned to visit and the sites I wanted to see when I got there. At the time, I hadn't finalized my travel plans, so I still had time to help with my grandson. I'd postponed my plans just so I could be around for the birth of my grandson and so I could spend some time getting to know him. I would come around during the week to watch him until his parents came home, but they wanted more. My son started asking why I had to go home at all since I didn't have anything to do, and I realized that they expected me to become a full-time unpaid nanny. I had to explain to them that it wouldn't be possible. I told them that I had saved for years to be able to afford my retirement and travel plans, and this was my time to enjoy it. I explained that I was happy to help them take care of their son, but that they shouldn't expect me to do it full-time or to be around indefinitely. They didn't take this well. Both of them became upset with me. My daughter-in-law got emotional and said that they thought family was supposed to help each other out and that she didn't want to leave the baby with strangers. My son joined in, accusing me of being selfish and saying it was my duty as the grandmother to help out with their child. Their reactions shocked me, and I got emotional myself. I felt very attacked and had to stop myself from crying while I explained that I was happy to help, but I couldn't commit to being their free child care. My son didn't relent, and he insisted that I could put off my travel for a few years until the baby was older. I told him that I was already getting old and only had a few more years where I could be active enough to live out my lifelong dream. I explained that that was part of the reason Pat wouldn't be going along with me. He was still healthy, but his age was starting to show, and he wasn't quite so spry anymore. He said that it was just an excuse and that I was prioritizing trips over my grandson. He offered a compromise in which I would take care of my grandson for at least 2 years, and if it was no longer fit enough to travel on my own, then they would accompany me. I refused it outright, pointing out that I would still be a nanny, and I wouldn't be able to enjoy my trips. Also, I had activities planned that I could only be enjoyed while I still was active, like swimming and hiking. After I refused his so-called compromise, things got even worse. He started saying I owed it to him as my son to help him raise his child now that he was starting his own family. He told me that I was selfish, prioritizing luxury trips over my grandson. That hurt me so much. I explained that my decision didn't come from a lack of love for my grandson. I spent my entire life taking care of my family and making sacrifices to ensure that they would have a decent trust fund when they were older. I'd worked myself to the bone and put my own dreams on hold for close to 50 years, and now that I had some freedom, I wanted to live out my dream. I deserved a break, but no matter how much I tried to reason with them, they didn't seem to see my point of view. Now, it's not like my son and his wife were desperate. Ashley is unemployed and should have nothing but time to take care of her new son, but she chooses to spend her time having fun instead. She's always attending social functions and parties. If she prioritized her time, she would definitely be able to take care of her son. I might be old-fashioned, but I believe becoming a mother means making some sacrifices for the good of your child. I've already made those sacrifices for my kids, and I think it's unfair for my son and his wife to ask me to make them again for their behalf. Even if they didn't want to take care of their child themselves, my son isn't exactly strapped for cash. He doesn't have a very high-paying job, but the disbursement from his trust would cover a large part of the cost of a nanny. It would definitely be enough for them to hire a babysitter whenever they needed one. When I pointed that out to him, he got mad and said the money from his trust was his, and he could spend it however he wanted. Things took a turn for the worse after the conversation. Now that they only called me whenever they needed me to watch their son, whenever I came over, they were cold to me and wouldn't talk to me more than they absolutely needed to. Sometimes I could overhear them making rude comments, most of which came from my daughter-in-law. I didn't appreciate the passive aggressiveness and judgment, but I also wanted to spend time with my grandson. One day, Sandra called me and asked me about the argument I had had with her brother. She said he had called her and said that I was being unreasonable and selfish. He said I was supposed to be happy to help him out since he was my child, and my traveling could wait. It felt horrible finding out that my son was bad-mouthing me to his sister. After I explained it to her, she said that she understood my point of view, but she felt that I should be able to give up at least a year to help take care of their son. She said that I always emphasized the importance of taking care of each other, and now I wasn't doing anything to help my son. This annoyed me because I expected my daughter to understand my position. I still can't believe that I'm being villainized for wanting to put myself first for the first time in my adult life. I decided that I needed to set some boundaries, and I told him that I loved their son and I would be glad to help watch him whenever they needed me. But I was old, and I deserved to enjoy my retirement. I had my own plans, and I wouldn't put them on hold for anyone. I told them that they needed to figure out their child care situation, whether that meant hiring a nanny or a babysitter or making some sacrifices of their own. My son got mad at that. His response sickened me. He said that if I wasn't willing to help their family, then I shouldn't be a part of it. He gave me an ultimatum. I should agree to take care of my grandson full time, or I wouldn't be allowed to see him anymore. I was heartbroken. I couldn't believe that my own son would threaten to keep my grandchild from me over this. I had to stand my ground, though. I told him that I wasn't going to be strong-armed into giving up my retirement. I had done my part as a mother, and I still was, and now it was their turn to step up as parents. I haven't heard from them at all since. My son didn't call, and I didn't visit. Pat is firmly on my side, though he believes I should have agreed for the sake of peace. He's always been softer on the kids than I am, and I had to explain to him that I couldn't set a precedent of rolling over whenever John threw a fit. He seemed unconvinced, but he left it to me to handle the situation how I felt was best. I spent my time planning out the first of my trips. It hasn't been as rewarding as I hoped because I'm still hurt that my son would cut ties rather than respect boundaries. I'm set to leave in a few days, but I'm finding it hard to look forward to living out my dream. I tried to call my son to check if I could see them before I left, but he's not answering my calls. Was I really the a-hole for saying I wouldn't move in to take care of my grandson? It sounds like you've worked incredibly hard to provide for your family, and it's understandable that you would want to enjoy your retirement after all those sacrifices. It's important to set boundaries and prioritize your own dreams, especially after dedicating so much of your own life to others. It's disappointing that your son and daughter-in-law aren't respecting you. You deserve to pursue your passions and travel the world. You're not the a-hole here, OP. Update. There were a lot of mixed opinions on my last post. One thing I'd like to make clear is that I never said I wouldn't help them take care of their baby. I babysat my grandson several times before we had our disagreement. Like I said, I love him a lot and I like to spend time with him. My problem was with his parents making demands of me without considering my desires. It was selfish of my son, and I expected better from the man I raised. Also, I don't think my son owes me because I set up a trust from him. You're missing my point. I simply pointed out that we had done our bit to provide for him as an adult. If I couldn't spare as much time as he'd like, the least he could do would use the money we provided to make up for that. After our disagreement, I decided to focus on my own happiness and the plans I had dreamed of for years. It broke my heart not to hear from my own son or to see my grandson, but I knew I couldn't give in to his ultimatum. It would help strip me of my hard-earned freedom and give my son and his wife the idea that they could walk all over me. I had a very good time on my first trip. I went to Italy and lived out my dream of enjoying the art, history, and culture of historical cities like Rome and Florence. I swam in the Mediterranean and hiked the Cinque Terre, which was probably the highlight of the trip for me. The scenery was gorgeous, and it was a satisfying challenge that I probably wouldn't have been able to undertake if I had waited until I was any older. The joy of my trip was somewhat stained by the bitter feelings I had after the disagreement we had. When I returned home, though, I felt fulfilled, in spite of the situation between me and my son. I felt like I had made the right decision, putting myself first for once in my life. A few days after I got back, I decided to talk to my son. I was the older person and I needed to be more mature. I tried to call first, but as usual, they didn't respond. I swallowed my pride and drove to their house. I was greeted by Ashley, and she didn't bother to hide her irritation. She stood there with crossed arms and said, "We're busy." Then she said we could talk if I was there to babysit. Her outright coldness took me by surprise, and I started feeling annoyed. It was worse because I could hear my grandson squealing from inside the house. I tried to be civil and told her that I hadn't heard from them and I wanted to check on my grandson. John came out and said that they didn't want anything to do with me if I wasn't ready to help them. I got tired of the ingratitude and I told them that I had already helped him. He just rolled his eyes and said, "Is this about the trust again?" I ignored that and pointed out that we had set up the trust to make sure he and Sandra were taken care of. I reminded them that it hadn't been an obligation and most children never got one from their parents. Ashley snorted and said, "Oh, please." She said that the trust fund wasn't anything special because they couldn't live off of it. I was starting to get angry. John and Ashley especially were disrespecting me, and I wasn't going to stand for much more of it. I told them that the trust had allowed them a more comfortable lifestyle, and it allowed them to make financial decisions that they wouldn't have been able to make without it, like hiring a babysitter or nanny. Suddenly, John snapped and shouted, "Shut up about the trust. You don't get to tell us how to spend it. It's my money." I just stood there in silence, staring at the two of them. Up until that point, I had always considered the money in the trust to belong to my kids, even before they were old enough to access the money. I didn't care about the money. I had my own retirement funds. I simply wanted my son to respect my boundaries and responsibly deal with the child care issue he was having. I had given him more chances than he had deserved, and I had been disrespected and shouted at for it. I wasn't going to take any more. Actually, it's not. It's a revocable trust, and I'm the trustee. They both froze and looked at me. John asked me what that meant. He suddenly didn't sound as confident as he had a few seconds ago. I explained that it meant I could cancel the trust at any time, and that was exactly what I would do. I'm pretty sure they both went pale. John just said, "You can't do that." I didn't respond to that, and I just told them that I'd tried to be generous, but they disrespected me and taken advantage of my kindness. If they couldn't appreciate the sacrifices I'd already made, then they didn't deserve to benefit from them. I went back to my car without another word. I had several missed calls from them by the time I got home. If the trust was so paltry, why were they so eager to defend it? I told Pat about what I wanted to do, and he was unsure. I explained that it needed to be done, and he left me to it once again. I talked to Pat's lawyer, and we had the trust revoked. I called John to let them know what I'd done, and he flared up like I expected. I don't want to write out all the nasty things he said, but the gist of it is that he said I betrayed him. He still had the same entitlement as before, insisting that I should have been ready to drop everything to take care of his son. He said I stole their financial security away from them. I just dropped the phone. I was done trying to be the bigger person. Sandra called me later and asked if I'd really canceled John's trust. She told me he'd called her ranting about it, saying that I'd gone too far. This time, Sandra completely agreed with me and said that John and Ashley were going out of their way not to pay a babysitter. She revealed that they had turned to her when I stopped helping, and they'd been demanding more and more from her. Sandra works as a freelance illustrator for children's books, so she doesn't have office hours, but she still needs to spend a lot of time on her work. When she heard that I'd canceled the trust, she followed suit and told them she had to stop babysitting because she couldn't keep up, just like they had with me. They'd turned against her instantly. John seemed to only care about family when it benefited him. We went for about 3 months with no contact. It hurt not to see my grandson, but I had to stand my ground. Imagine my surprise when John called me one afternoon. He started with small talk, and I could tell he was building up to something. Eventually he came out with it, and he confessed that things were very difficult without the disbursement from the trust. It turned out that it had made a huge difference in their lifestyle. They weren't struggling, but without it, they had to make some serious changes to how they handled their finances. I was silent for a while, and I think he got the hint that I was waiting for an apology. He apologized for the way he had acted, and he said that it was his wife who had pushed him to get me to babysit. She didn't want to take time out of her busy social life to watch a baby, and she often complained that the trust disbursement wasn't enough to spare on a babysitter. She was taking the loss of the disbursement pretty badly, it seemed. I can't tell you how relieved I was to get an apology, but it didn't change the fact that I was angry and disappointed in my son. All I said was, "I'm not going to restore your trust." He was quiet for a while, and then he asked if I would like to see my grandson. I jumped at the opportunity, and he brought him around the very next day. I felt victorious, finally getting to see my grandbaby after all this time. I think my son could tell I was in a good mood because he tried his luck at asking about his trust again. I pointed out that he'd been awful to me and his sister, and that I wouldn't just throw money at him because he'd done the bare minimum. I let him know that I appreciated this step he'd taken, but it would take time for the wounds to heal. He looked disappointed, but he nodded. It's been 3 months now since then, and I've visited my grandson to take care of him several times now, but my son and his wife haven't once made a comment about me moving in again. In fact, from what I've seen, it looks like Ashley has stepped up to her duties as a mother. She goes out a lot less often and spends more time at home with her son. The change in their behavior has honestly warmed my heart. A few days ago, when I was about to leave after taking care of my grandson, John came up to me. He more or less begged me to reconsider my stance on the trust. He said they were managing to get by, but it had been a hard adjustment. He told me they were both sorry for how they treated me and that they'd learned their lesson. I just said I would think about it. I still haven't made a decision yet. I honestly do think they've learned their lesson, but I'm wondering if I'm letting him off the hook too easily. The money from his trust is still there, untouched. Like I said, I don't need it. Perhaps I could set up the trust again, with the understanding that it could be revoked if he pulls another nasty stunt like that again. It's great to hear that your son has finally come around and that there's been a positive shift in their behavior. Your decision not to immediately restore the trust shows that you're prioritizing respect and boundaries, which is essential. It's understandable to consider setting up a trust again with conditions, as it could encourage responsibility on their part. Ultimately, it's about finding a balance between your love for your grandson and ensuring your own needs and boundaries as respected. What would you have done? Thank you for joining us today in the rLounge. Be sure to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on our next video. Until next time, and please put your chair back where you found it.